said, I'm Bert Mulchaey. I'm supervising biologist East Bay Mud. I've been working on the watershed now for 29 plus years as a biologist and a supervisor. Um, Today, I want to talk a little bit about East Bay Mud's watershed restoration and our species management. Um, the first half of the presentation, I was going to talk a little bit about the restoration work and the species management work we've done under our habitat conservation plan. And then the second half, talk about a couple different fish passage projects that East Bay Mud has implemented on two creeks. One is Pinole Creek and the other is Kaiser Creek. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the second half. So to get started, I just wanted to point out that um, East Bay Mud's mission statement is pretty unique for water resource agencies in the Bay Area. It puts managing of natural resources and protecting the environment right up there at the top with high quality water and wastewater services. So East Bay Mud takes its stewardship goals seriously. And so if you're not familiar with East Bay Mud, we have about 30,000 acres in the East Bay of watershed lands. Most of them surround reservoirs. So there's San Pablo, Briones, Lafayette, Upper San Leandro, and Chabot reservoirs. Most of these east of Oakland, Berkeley area. And then we have one reservoir watershed that does not have a reservoir, and that's the Pinole Creek watershed. East Bay Mud owns about 3,000 acres in that watershed. Over the years, East Bay Mud has documented about 1,400 species on our watershed, and there are 7 special status species that we have covered by our East Bay Mud, East Bay Habitat Conservation Plan. The Habitat Conservation Plan was an agreement signed in 2008 with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and basically what it does on the basic level is it says, if we do our watershed maintenance activities, things like building fence and pond maintenance and road work, if we do it in a way that conforms with the Habitat Conservation Plan and all the avoidance measures we have in there for species, that if we happen to incidentally take one of these species through harm or mortality, that East Bay Mud would not be held responsible for that. And so the point of the HCP is basically to spend time um, enhancing their habitat and protecting their habitat over time so that's a net benefit for species. And so our HCP covers 2 plant species, the Santa Cruz tar plant and the pallid manzanita, but also rainbow trout, California red-legged frog, western pond turtle, Alameda whipsnake, and pallid bat. And the western pond turtle is not quite yet listed as a species, and the pallid bat is not listed, but those are 2 species that we ended up putting in the HCP in case they became listed over the 30-year permit term. So this permit does not actually expire till 2038. So we're about 18, 19 years into it now. Uh, Most of the species we manage on our watershed, um, of the most sensitive species, some of them require really very little direct management from us. Examples are rainbow trout and the Alameda whipsnake. These species, we basically just protect their habitat and let them be, and that's kind of our strategy because the for rainbow trout, for example, we fence out the main stem of Pinole Creek so cattle can't get into the creek. We have a 100-foot buffer from the creek, and we maintain that habitats, but we don't actively do a lot for rainbow trout. And there is one exception I'll talk about later. But some of our species management is much more active, and examples of that are our pallid manzanita and our red-legged frog watershed management activities. A little bit about rainbow trout. We mostly under the HCP, we do population monitoring. So we do annual electrofishing, and we also do annual spawning surveys where we walk the creek looking for their nests or redds in the gravel. But we also do some habitat mapping on a regular basis to make sure that the creeks are providing the habitat they need. And the habitat mapping also helps us identify sometimes if there's issues like barriers. And barrier assessment and removal is part of our management for the species. It doesn't have to be done very often. If you look on the photo on the right, it shows a large woody debris dam that is natural in origin. They often form and don't cause problems, but when they really do cause problems, we evaluate them and remediate them at times. Generally, these natural barriers are kind of less of a problem than the man-made ones that we've created for fish. The Alameda whipsnake, another major species in our HCP. This is a beautiful snake. It's a very fast snake. It mostly eats western fence lizards, so you can imagine it has to be pretty fast to eat those. It's listed as threatened by both the state and federal governments, and the species core habitat exists mostly on steep, brushy slopes. And the entire world's population of Alameda whipsnake pretty much lives in Contra Costa and Alameda counties. It has a very small range. There is a few small scattered populations in the South Bay as well. But the bulk of their habitat exists pretty much on East Bay mud and East Bay Parks property. The Alameda whipsnake is another species that we mostly just monitor their habitat. We monitor brush habitat over time to make sure we're not losing any. And we also monitor the species. My crew does trapping for whip snakes in certain habitats to demonstrate that the habitat is maintaining the species. But the biggest part is we basically avoid habitat impacts from our district operations. So if you look at the upper right photo, these steep brushy slopes, we avoid them for the most part. And if we have to do work there, we generally do hand work with hand crews instead of using heavy equipment or something that would be more damaging. And we don't really do a lot of restoration for Alameda whipsnake. There's no really established scientific way to improve whipsnake habitat. So we go with the strategy for now of mostly maintaining what we have and trying to expand it a little bit. Pallid manzanita is one of the plant species in our HCP. It's a federally threatened species, and we only have one small population on the East Bay mud watershed. Most of the pallid manzanita population in the East Bay is on East Bay Park District properties like Huckleberry and El Sobrante. But this is a very endangered plant, very small populations. The population on our watershed has about 100 something plants, and it's basically found in an area about 100 feet wide and 200 feet long on the top of a very isolated ridge. This species is really well fire adapted. It does much better when its seeds are scarified by fire. Plus, the species depends on fire because it gets out competed by other types of more aggressive vegetation, other trees and other plants. So you could imagine in Oakland, this population is a stone's throw from Oakland and the fire history there. Um, Fires are suppressed, and this species has not been doing well without that fire for management. So for this population, again, we do a lot of population monitoring. We go up there every year and we count the plants and we look at issues. Is there anything we can do to improve habitat? A more extreme example of this is the photo on the right of a large Monterey pine that we had removed at the beginning of our HCP. This pine was growing so large it pretty much blacked out the entire population of in that area and it started to lose plants. Some of the adult plants were starting to suffer. So we hiked in and had this Monterey pine removed. We often go in there on an annual basis and figure out what other trees might need to be trimmed back if they're overshadowing our pallid manzanita population. And we hope someday we can use fire in a limited way to start helping its propagation. The hope is someday we can get some burn boxes and basically you place the box on the ground and burn inside that box. It's a very safe way to keep fire from spreading, and it also should hopefully be enough to maybe scarify the seeds. Um, California red-legged frog, and this is a real major species for us as far as, and it's the most active management we do of any species on our watershed. Red-legged frogs are federally threatened, and they're state species of concern, and they live in creeks and ponds here in the East Bay, and they've had a lot of habitat loss, introduced species have been a problem, and disease. So statewide, they've really declined a lot because of these reasons. But on our watershed, they're doing quite well. I think in large part due to the habitat conservation plan. Most of our local creeks really can't provide the habitat that they once did for frogs. They're too channelized. We've got invasive species, all these issues of urban creeks. So they're not as good a habitat in a lot of ways for um, red-legged frog breeding. And that means that the pond habitats on our watershed have become more important for these species. So these are ponds that are largely cattle ponds, or there are some ponds that we have restored just for red-legged frog purposes. Um, and the problem is these ponds silt in and fail over time. They become silted in, the vegetation becomes too thick, um, and the hydro period, the water levels pretty much go away. And so we do work on these ponds, and it's completed in the dry season under our HCP. All of this work is conducted by with biologists and our heavy equipment operators. And so the biologists are there watching every scoop of dirt that comes out of these ponds to make sure that we're not scooping up frogs or harming any other species. And these ponds are basically designed to try to provide habitat for all the life stages of red-legged frog because they have become such important habitat elements for red-legged frog. Here's just an example of pond restoration. On the left, you can see the pond that's very silted in. On the right, you see a pond that's just been dug out, and it looks a little bit stark, and you may think, well, there's not a whole lot going on in this pond, but the truth is, when we restore these ponds, that hydro period and that depth of water is so critical for the species. And so generally when we dig the ponds out, we leave vegetation and we leave small pieces of vegetation. It grows back so aggressively that by the next spring, there's plenty of habitat and cover for frogs. But if we found that if we don't dig out enough of the vegetation, we end up coming back too often to dig these ponds out. We want to only have to come back every 20, 25 years in some cases to clean these ponds out because they provide really good habitat for the frogs. Generally, we do uh, population monitoring. This is again a big piece of belly frog monitoring is a big piece of my staff's time any given year. Uh, we monitor adults, egg masses, tadpoles, and juveniles, so all the life stages. On the right, you can see a photo of a red-legged frog egg mass, and then a tadpole at the bottom that's pretty much ready to metamorphose there. So we go out in the ponds, we do night surveys. In January and February to find out where the adults are gathering and where they're likely to breed. Then we return to those ponds to see if there are egg masses or tadpoles in that pond a few months later. And then we return often again to look at the juvenile life stages just to make sure that all of this breeding is actually contributing to more frogs on the watershed. And we often do other studies to try to determine what's going on and inform our land management. So these ponds, as we do them, we often want to know what are the habitat characteristics that are good for frogs? What do they use? And so we've done some frog telemetry work. most of this work was done at the beginning of our HCP when we signed it in 2008. We really started to aggressively work on our ponds. I think the first year we dug out 12 ponds or so, and we wanted to see how it was working, where the frogs were hanging out. So we transmitted a good handful of red-legged frogs with these radio transmitters. They last about 13 weeks with the battery. On the right, you can see a frog on its back. It's basically a belt that goes around its waist with a small transmitter and an antenna. And that allows us to follow these frogs around for a 13-week period, and then we recapture them and we can replace the transmitter or just remove it and let them go. And so this has allowed us to study behavior and habitat use. We found a few interesting things from this study. We've found that they really like ponds with islands. They love to be on the islands because I think there's less terrestrial predators, but also it's very they sit on these islands and it's close to deep water habitat that they can access immediately. But we did generally find that these frogs, when they find a place, they like to hang out there for a really long time. And so we'd go back and a couple times a week, 3 times a week, and we'd find frogs in the same spot over and over again. So when they find something they like, they pretty much stick to it. But there are some examples of movement. This graphic was just to represent a couple of frogs that we transmitted. Um, at the bottom of the screen there, on July 12th, there's a pond there where we actually transmitted these frogs. And these ponds start to dry down pretty significantly in July, and predation of frogs tends to increase significantly. Not only land-based predators, but birds as well start to visit these ponds very frequently as the water levels go down and the frogs are more concentrated in a smaller area. And so they do experience pretty heavy predation. And when we uh, when we tagged these frogs, you could see one of the frogs went directly from the pond to a wetted area, a seep in the hillsides. There's basically a wet area coming out of the hillside at the very top left of the screen. The other frog actually left the pond, went to a very small little wet area just 6 days later, and then eventually ended up the next day in the same wet area the other frog went to. So this kind of gave us some ideas about movement of frogs. We do think that they use riparian areas pretty heavily when they move, but you could see some of these movements are definitely across the landscape, and it's quite risky to move across the landscape, but it's also quite risky, I think, for them to stay in these ponds when they're drying down. And so I expect that these frogs ended up like others we had transmitted, ended up somewhere in the riparian area in the creeks, just hunkered down and hidden for much of the dry season. So, what are some interesting places we found frogs after we transmitted them? This is a wood rat nest. We had tracked a group of frogs in one pond for several weeks. They hung out on the edge of the pond and then they all left. And we found the signal inside this wood rat nest. And uh, we started to think after a few weeks that the frog either slipped the transmitter or something ate it or whatever. So we got curious and we removed a few sticks from the wood rat nest. And sure enough, the frog was inside, happy as a clam. Uh, and were wondering, well, is this an active wood rat nest? So we did put a wildlife camera out, and sure enough, at night this wood rat would come out, and so this frog was living in an active wood rat nest with the wood rat for several months. And this is not something that I've ever seen in the literature, but it's just kind of interesting. It makes some sense. There's some moist cover, and uh, it's a place that a frog. I always thought that the rat might kick him out eventually, but in reality, he stayed there quite a long time. Unfortunate areas we found frogs. This is a California red-sided garter snake, and that lump in the center in its stomach is one of our transmitted frogs. This was a frog we watched. We transmitted him in the pond, and he went downstream, and just for days and days, he would just hang out on a bank next to a stump, kind of exposed, right in the, right in on the creek channel. And sure enough, eventually something managed to eat him because he didn't find enough cover. So this is California red-sided garter snake that ate him. We found out a lot about bird predation. Birds are more of a factor than I would have even thought. I think just watching, spending a lot of time with transmitted frogs, following them, seeing the birds kind of congregate in these ponds, waiting for the water to come down. And this was a frog that we transmitted in a pond, and then one day the signal totally disappeared. We went around the watershed looking for the radio signal and eventually found a very weak signal and followed it. About 2 miles away, we found this tree with this rotted out branch and this hole, and the transmitter was sitting there right in that hole in all the whitewash from all the bird poop. So this frog was basically eaten by a bird and pooped out right there in that tree about 10 feet off the ground. And then finally, another interesting place we found California red-legged frogs. This is one of the biggest frogs we ever transmitted. In the center of the picture, there's a red-legged frog kind of with his nose facing upward. This frog is sitting in a creek pool on a branch of a tree. And what you can't easily tell from this photo is that this was the coldest temperatures we had on record since I've been at East Bay Mud for almost 30 years. And the creek pool froze over, and there was a half an inch sheet of ice on top of this pool. And so we showed up here and we saw this frog with its nose up against the sheet of ice, thinking he's a goner, he's a frog sickle or something. But turns out they are adapted for these types of environments. This frog was fine when the pool basically defrosted over that day, and later we followed him for another several weeks downstream as he moved around. Incredible story of what we had not thought that was survivable, because the entire pool was frozen over and he was trapped under the ice. So some interesting things we saw. We learned a lot about the habitats that these frogs use and what their behaviors are. And we hope to use it every day when we go to restore ponds and figure out what are the factors that are key for frogs to use a certain habitat. So that is kind of the first half of my presentation, talking about our HCP species management. The second half, I wanted to talk more specifically about some fish passage projects. So we want to go a little bit over the basics before we talk about the two restoration projects. So what are rainbow trout and steelhead? It's important to remember that rainbow trout and steelhead are actually the same species, Oncorhynchus micus, and they both spawn in our local creeks. The females dig a red, which is a kind of a nest they dig in the gravel, and they deposit eggs there. But the difference is that rainbow trout live their entire lives in these creek habitats. And steelhead, they rear in these creeks for about a year, and then they decide somehow to go to the ocean. And then they can spend a couple years out at the ocean becoming really large fish. The difference is, those rainbow trout that stay in the creek might be about 6 inches long after 3 or 4 years. The steelhead come back, they're 20, 24 inches, and they're much bigger. They have a very abundant food source in the ocean, and they are a great way to bring ocean nutrients back to the freshwater environment. So they come back as basically, I like to think of them as supercharging your spawning potential for the population. So they are the same fish. It's just a behavioral thing that is the difference between steelhead and trout. Steelhead are what we call anadromous. They go to salt water and come back to the freshwater, whereas the resident rainbows stay in the creeks year round. In our area, this is a map of the Bay Area surrounding areas. This is where the Central California coast steelhead is, and this is the distinct population segment that was listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. And so all the steelhead that exists still in the Bay Area are listed as threatened because they have declined by over 90% and very significantly over the years, mostly to loss of habitat. Both spawning and rearing habitat in the creeks has been lost. And so they're really not doing well in the Bay Area. So I wanted to talk about two different fish passage projects that East Bay Mud has completed in the last several years. The first is the Tomato Stand Fish Passage Project, and this is on Pinole Creek. And Pinole Creek is a 15 square mile reservoir, I mean, sorry, 15-mile square watershed that is basically split into three kind of segments. There's a city portion at the bottom down near the bay and I-80. And then in the middle, as you can see in this map, you can see the outline of the boundaries of the East Bay Mud Watershed. And so that is protected East Bay Mud Watershed. And then kind of at the top of the watershed, there's the Briones Agricultural Preserve, which is basically 5-acre ranches and above. So not heavily developed in the upper watershed. It does have its issues, I think, related to those ranches. But in this situation, I want to talk about the Tomato Stand Culvert Project. It's the kind of bigger call out there on the right-hand side of the screen. So it's about, the middle upper watershed of Pinole Creek. And the reason this project came to be was really due to two other projects downstream, and the main one being the I-80 Culverts Fish Passage Project. So if you look at the upper left of the map at I-80, that is the location where the fish migration day is going to occur down at the bowling alley at I-80. And this project was completed in 2016 by the Contra Costa Resource Conservation District. And they installed a fish ladder and some other elements to improve fish passage. And that was the main barrier really to steelhead. Pinole Creek and Pinole residents are extremely lucky. Of all the creeks in the Bay Area, it seems to have had the least amount of fish barriers installed as they developed the city of Pinole. So as you go from the bay up to the city limits, there's 7 different bridges. In most creeks that they're not so lucky, there's usually a culvert or something in there that blocks fish passage. And so once they fixed the I-80 culverts, they pretty much allowed fish to get up to the East Bay Mud watershed. But then just a year after they completed that project in 2017, the Pinole Y culvert blew out pretty spectacularly and the road washed out. And the county wanted to replace that culvert with another culvert. But eventually, we convinced them that a bridge would be a better idea for fish passage and for other reasons. And so in the center of this graphic, you can see a very tiny call out that says Pinole Y Bridge. And that's the location at which the bridge was built after that 2017 storm. And this was not a designed fish passage project, but it became a project that allowed fish even better access to the East Bay Mud watershed. And so once those two projects happened, uh, East Bay Mud started looking around at ourselves and going, well, do we have any culverts that are a problem? And we hired a consultant to look into culverts on our watershed. And this is what the Tomato Stand Culvert look like. So it's a perched culvert, pretty bad problems, particularly at low flows, a large jump, not very much flow. Um, and so we hired a consultant to come down and do some analysis of multiple culverts on our watershed. They looked at this culvert and one I'm going to talk about after this, the two dog culvert. But anyway, they came and looked at it and said, yes, this is a problem. Talked about a bridge probably being one of the better options for improving fish passage at this site. So we hired RDG to design a fix for this area, and so they did design the fish passage channel and a bridge at this site. The interesting thing about this whole project was most of this was done in-house by East Bay Mud staff, from rangers to biologists to heavy equipment operators, truck drivers, welders. Um, Most of this project was completed in-house by East Bay Mud, except for the abutments, which we hired a contractor to install the abutments. But the first part of this project, and this project was funded by the Wildlife Conservation Board. We got a grant to complete this fish passage project, a grant for $787,000. We ultimately came in about $100,000 under budget because of the amount of East Bay mud labor that we were able to utilize for the project. But ultimately, the first stage was just getting the materials staged because once we dug the culvert out, we lost access to the road. So we purchased and had about 400 tons of boulders delivered to the site. That's about 40 large of those large East Bay mud dump trucks that you see driving around the East Bay. They were delivered in these large end dumps, mostly for the large and medium size material. But the very largest boulders that weighed over a ton were delivered on flatbed trailer and pulled off with an excavator. But once we had the material delivered, we actually were able to start the actual project. And so we started with dewatering. This shows our cofferdam. This cofferdam was to dry down the site where we're going to be digging and working. But there's a pipe down the middle, as you can see. So the creek from above flows into that pipe. And by gravity flow, the flow in the creek moves through the site in the pipe and then to the area at the bottom of the site to keep the creek flowing. And then on the right, you can see a fish screen that we installed to keep fish from coming downstream into that dewatered site. Ultimately, we took about 900 cubic yards of soil from the top of the culvert. Basically, that whole road prism was removed. That's again about 90 of those big East Bay mud dump trucks. Was that material was hauled off, um, and the culvert that was removed was an 8-foot corrugated metal culvert, about 60 feet long. And this photo on the right shows us removing the last 20-foot section of that 60-foot culvert. Once we got the culvert removed, we excavated to elevations as required in the drawings, and we moved on to installing H-piles for the abutments. I apologize if this video doesn't work very well, but we'll give it a shot to see. But this was how they installed the H-piles. Um, I guess the sound is pretty limited, but basically they pounded these H piles one at a time. We installed 4 of them for each abutment, and the abutments sit on top of those H piles that are driven 30 feet basically to bedrock. This is the part we had a concrete contractor come out and frame the abutments and install the steel. On the right, you can kind of see all the rebar it takes and how it's installed over the top of those pounded H piles. Once they finished all the framing, they used a concrete pump to pump. Uh, it's about 8.5 uh, I mean, sorry, cement trucks loads to fill the abutments. Once the abutments were filled, we moved on to channel construction, the main part of the fish passage project, which is excavation of the channel. We excavated about 3 feet deeper than the ultimate elevation of the channel. On the right, you can kind of see the drawing of the actual channel, and it shows uh, how we were basically placing 3 feet of engineered stream bed material. It's about 3 feet thick, but at the top and the bottom of the site, we installed these cutouts to stabilize the site, keep it from becoming undercut. We started at the very bottom and we just worked our way up, building um, the channel, uh, basically taking boulders one at a time, the very largest boulders, and setting them in a somewhat randomized pattern, and then filling in between those boulders with smaller boulder material. And so this is built, that 3 foot thickness of boulder is built in 1 foot lifts. So uh, we put a foot of material down, put in some fines, jetted in to the interstitial spaces. So like you can see on the right, Mitch is jetting in those fines in between the rocks and stabilize those rocks and basically kind of cement them together. And so we would build uh, a foot, and then we'd add another foot, jet it in, and then add the final foot and jet it in. And hopefully, when you're done, you jetted everything in, and the water flows over the surface, over the top, and doesn't go down. And so we were pretty successful at that. When we released water from the creek, it all stayed on the surface where it's supposed to be. This is kind of what the abutments, the finished abutments and the finished channel look like. That pipe going down the middle again is bringing that creek flow to keep flow in good condition downstream of our project site. Once the abutments were complete, we had a prefabricated steel bridge delivered from Texas. It was 2 8 foot wide by 50 foot long pieces. The We had a 75-ton crane that took the pieces off the flatbed truck and placed them in between the abutments. This is a very gratifying part of the project because it goes really fast, and in an hour, all of a sudden, you have a bridge. And so, the fortunately, we only had about 2 inches of space on each side to fit these bridges into the abutment, and everything was done properly, so everything fit just fine. Then when we were done with that, the welders came in and welded the bridge to the steel plate. These are East Bay mud welders that came out. And on the photo on the right, you can kind of see there's a shelf on the abutment, the concrete shelf, and there's a metal plate that sits on the shelf, and they welded the girders to that plate, and that plate is tightened down. Those bolts are installed in the concrete when they poured the abutments. So once the bridge was stabilized, we brought in about 800 cubic yards of AB gravel, and it was distributed across the road and the bridge, and then it was compacted with a roller. This is all East Bay Mud heavy equipment operators doing that work. And then we moved, once the bridge was installed, we moved to erosion control and planting at the site. Uh, East Bay mud biologists and rangers put out the jute netting and the straw wattles, and we planted about 16 trees, uh, riparian trees for the site. We lost 2 trees that we had to remove for the project, and we had to mitigate those trees, but we planted extra trees because we felt there was enough space to add more trees. And then finally, they we installed a lot of willow staking along the edges um, for stabilization of the channel. And in these photos, you can see a little bit of those willow stakes sticking up, but the photo on the left is a photo from the very bottom of the site, looking upstream once all the work was completed. And then the photo on the right is from the very top of the site, looking downstream, um, once the water was released and the cofferdam was removed. So the I don't have a an updated picture. I wasn't able to put one in here before this presentation, but uh, everything looks good. Everything survived. Those takes about 80% of them at least have sprouted and are taking root. So there is a lot of willow growth happening right now. And I just wanted to finish with this video, just kind of shows some of the flood flows we saw at the height of the rains this winter, the flows through our site at the bridge, full channel flows, and something to challenge our site a little bit, and everything held up pretty well, which was great to see. Once we finished this project, we did spawning surveys this winter focused from this site upstream, and we found five good-sized steelhead reds upstream, which is a record. I don't think we've ever found more than two or three in the upper watershed before. So I think the project was quite successful, and we were really gratified to see steelhead spawning upstream. And the last project I want to talk a little bit about was the Two Dog Fish Passage project. This is this is basically east of San Leandro, Oakland area. Upstream of Chabot Reservoir is our USL, or Upper San Leandro Reservoir, a watershed off of Redwood Road. Um, Upper San Leandro Reservoir has an eastern tributary called Kaiser Creek. So if you look at the right of this drawing, there's a little Two Dog culvert call out. That's where our project occurred. Kaiser Creek is one of my favorite East Bay creeks, completely different than anything else you ever see in the East Bay. Uh, I you go in this creek, you think you're in the Sierras. It's just completely boulder, cobble dominated creek channel, and it's the only creek on East Bay Mud watershed that is 100% within our watershed. The headwaters all the way to its confluence with USL Reservoir. There's a landlocked population of rainbow trout in Upper San Leandro Reservoir, and they've been landlocked basically in this drainage since 1875 when Chabot Dam was built. But then in 1927, um, Upper San Leandro Dam was built, further landlocking them farther upstream in the watershed. The positive thing is that there are some good tributary habitats. Uh, Redwood Creek, San Leandro Creek, Kaiser Creek, and Moraga Creek. And these fish can spawn and rear in all of those creeks. So this population of rainbow trout has persisted after being landlocked. And the cool thing about this population is they're a genetically pure strain of rainbow trout. So we've never planted hatchery trout in San Leandro Creek because there's no fishing allowed there. And so these fish are the pure genetic stock. They have not interbred with hatchery fish. And because they are pure steelhead adapted to this area, their significance for East Bay Creek restoration is pretty high. This would be the fish that I would look for if I restored a creek and wanted to return a steelhead run. These would be the fish that I would choose to seed that population. It's a possibility I hope to see happen someday in the future. Beautiful fish, extremely well adapted. We see them in environments in these creeks during drought that are extremely stressful, and most people think fish can't survive. These fish can't survive those type of conditions of high temperature, low DO, but they do. And so a really a jewel of East Bay Mud's watershed. Um, and these are adfluvial, what we call adfluvial basically, or petadromous fish because they're no longer anadromous. They cannot go to the ocean. They use USL reservoir as their ocean. So they may rear in the creek and some of them stay in the creek and some of them go to the reservoir to live for several years. And then when they go back, they are in the, usually in the 13 to 20-inch size range. So these fish that you see here on the right are fish that have never left the reservoir. Even the one on the top, you can see barely, it has a little bit of that hook jaw that you get from Omicus, which is pretty cool. So these fish had this passage obstacle in Kaiser Creek. This was another large 6-foot corrugated metal culvert, the Two Dog culvert. We had a consultant come out and look at it, and they again said, a bridge would be a good idea here and a fish passage channel. So we removed the culvert. This project was done, in my opinion, a little bit cart before the horse, a little bit backwards um, because of funding and access and other issues. We built the channel first and then ended up buttoning up the site and then coming back to do the abutments the next year. And normally it'd be easier to do the abutments first and then build the channel, but the culvert was in really bad shape. If you look at it, here you can see it's crushed, and if you go inside it, it's twisted and it's broken. We didn't feel that it would survive another big winter, and we were worried that all this material would blow out and end up downstream. So we ended up building the channel as soon as we could, buttoning up the site, coming back the next year, installing the abutments and the bridge. It was a little bit more challenging to do it that way, but ultimately we were in a hurry and we really wanted to see the channel done before that culvert was to blow out. We eventually went and installed abutments. These abutments are huge compared to the ones um, for the tomato stand project I just talked about because they don't have the driven piles. So these footings. They're very large footings, 13 feet wide, 2 feet deep, and then they're actually keyed into the bank, and then the abutment rises above that. These abutments were 14 feet tall, which is extremely large abutments for such a small bridge project. But ultimately, there were some reasons behind that. But this is what the forms look like. The other thing to know about this project is it is kind of out in the middle of nowhere. It's a 15-minute drive out, dirt roads, very windy dirt roads to get here. That was the most challenging aspect of this project was the access issues. Getting the contractor out there, getting the concrete trucks out there, and getting the bridge out there was quite an ordeal. Ultimately, we found a concrete contractor was brave enough to drive their trucks out there. Fortunately, we got the abutments done. And then we had this bridge, which was a 20-foot wide bridge. It was a 13-foot section and an 8-foot wide section, which caused a lot of problems trying to get it out to the site. It's extremely windy road and trying to fit that out. We couldn't get truckers, normal trucking companies to do it, but we found a logging truck that would do it. And the logging truck has kind of an articulated back on it. And so he was able to basically, when he turns these tight corners, the back end, instead of cutting the corner, steers wide. And so he drove out there like it was nothing. So it was really great to finally see, because that was one of our biggest problems was how are we going to get this big bridge out in the middle of nowhere? And so the bridge was delivered and we installed it with a crane, just like the last project. This is ultimately what the site looked like when we were complete. Um, this is the creek channel. Basically, uh, started with a rock weir. A lot of the rock in here was challenged severely by a huge winter we had a few winters ago in 20, was it 24? Um, and It held up pretty well. It did rearrange a little bit, but we've not only monitored rainbow trout above this, but for the first time in decades of monitoring, we've seen Sacramento sucker, which are a native fish that has gotten up this high and has spawned up above this structure. Sacramento suckers don't have the same swimming performance abilities that rainbow trout do. So if suckers are getting up there, the trout are getting up there without any problems. And with that, I think that is it for my presentation. I usually end a lot of my presentations with this slide. It's one of the favorite photos I've taken in the past 30 years on the watershed. This is a hatchling western pond turtle. And no, my staff do not have unusually large hands. The turtle is just freshly hatched